Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the ITSS Verona Members Series. On this episode with the Central and South America team, we're going to be speaking to Tobias Belgrano, who is a political analyst specializing in Latin American and global affairs. A native of Argentina, he focuses on multiple areas of the global South. Particularly, he looks at Argentina, Taiwan, and the broader Asia Pacific, providing analysis on the relations between these regions, as well as each independently. Thank you for joining us.
Hey Sarah, how are you?
I'm good. So, could you provide a brief background on some of the policies Javier Milei has implemented so far and how these differ from those of previous regimes?
Well, our president is mainly very well known worldwide because of his extravagance and his new model, which is generating a lot of hope in especially economic liberals and the right wing in general. During the beginning of his administration, he posed himself as this new rebel right winger, and in many cases, especially for example in some protests in Europe, many people wore masks with his face, kind of like this right wing Che Guevara, like this symbol of resistance and rebellion against a woke establishment. So he was very famous among that, but in Argentina and in the menu of options you have in Argentina's economic, the recipe is quite familiar to us. I mean, we're very well versed in what's happening right now in Argentina. Uh, because we have had several experiences of this kind of economic model, despite it's sold to the world as a libertarian new techno capitalist movement. In reality, is a system of debt accumulation and using the foreign debt to generate artificial demand for Argentinian peso. What this is done by overvaluing the Argentinian peso. When the peso gets overvalued, the state starts to pay a high interest rate that go beyond inflation and make it very attractive to foreign investors. That's why a lot of newsrooms and programs like the BBC or The Economist were very critical initially to Javier Milei and saw him as a right-wing populist extremist. And right after Milei started and he started to impose this program, those same news channels were very favorable of Milei's model, and they usually it's contrasted with Trump's because Trump is what we might know as a more Peronist approach, like using tariffs to prevent dumping from other countries, like China is doing to the U.S. right now. So generally, in foreign media, the two models are very compared. Milei being like more positive and more friendly to foreign investors, and Trump being more aggressive and more criticized. So that what's the difference from the previous regime? As I was mentioning, the state, instead of printing money to get to make consumption, the consumption will work. The state doesn't print any money and prevents inflation. There's no high inflation. I mean, not that we are used to. I mean, internationally it's high inflation, but right now it's not normal for a country to have these levels of inflation. It's a relief for us right now. But the thing is, it's not sustainable in the future because it consumes a lot of foreign reserves of the central bank and it demands a lot of debt from the IMF and from other international banks that provide debt to the Argentinian government to pay the investor to sustain the demand in the Argentinian peso. So they keep their positions in Argentinian peso. The problem is that from one day to another, from one second to the other, the investors, for example, Peronism wins the elections in the end of the year, or there's any kind of political unrest, the investors flee. There's a massive flee of investors, and the positions in peso fall apart in from one moment to another, and you have a massive currency devaluation, which in generally causes the destabilization of the government. Gen- what happened last time with Mauricio Macri was that the investors felt he was not able to honor the debts he had. So they escaped massively. This generated instability in his administration. He lost the elections in 2019, and this accelerated the flee of capital from Argentina. So it's not as such as new economic model as it is sold abroad in general. This is important to clarify.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful and helps clarify. So, who is Guillermo Moreno, and how does his interpretation of Peronism differ from that of the Kirchners?
Well, Guillermo Moreno, it's not a new character in politics, but he was the Secretary of Commerce during Cristina Kirchner's administration. His methodology and his ways generated a trauma in many businessmen from Argentina. He was very like Trump style in like fast decisions, putting tariff, changing pricing, regulation which stop foreign investors to come, or excessively protecting industrial Argentinian companies. For example, there was this example which is kind of bizarre, but it really clarifies what the character is. Guillermo Moreno, for example, during his period as Secretary of Commerce, he didn't want the Epson cartridges from printers to get into Argentina, so he used the Secretary of Commerce to subsidize a local uh, refiller of printer cartridges and make him a, a big industrial company that provided Epson printed cartridges for printers in Argentina instead of importing them, because they didn't want to use the reserves, the Argentinian foreign reserves, to promote imports rather than promoting industrialization. Who's the character? In general, considered a conservative Peronist. Kirchnerism and Peronism from Kirchnerism is perceived as being leftist. I mean, generally in the last 20 years, Peronism was perceived as being leftist. But for example, if you go to the initial doctrine of Peronism and the birth of Peronism is born in a very similar way as Trumpism was born. Argentina in the 1940s was very impacted by the 1930s crisis in the US and the crack of Wall Street. So Argentina was very affected by that, and that generates a lot of unemployment, especially in the provinces. As Argentina is different in the structure as the US, this caused a lot of migration from the countryside to the big cities, especially to Buenos Aires. Buenos Aires, which was a almost European capital with a very cosmopolitan city, which was compared many times with the Paris of South America, a mass of unemployed workers, which were especially racially very different. Concept in their conception of life, they were very conservative, very used to the countryside, what's called personalism, like leadership with personalism. And that's why Peronism is emerged, because this mass population was excluded, marginalized, especially because the Europe-based population of Buenos Aires rejected these masses of people, and Perón was the first person who took and embraced this mass and transformed it in a very similar way as Trump did, organize it politically. The white workers from the American Rust Belt is not that different from those people. They have another conception of life, which is more anti-migrant, which is more less culturally mixed as the Argentinians, but indeed it's the same construction of an excluded social subject that Peronism embraces. And that's why Guillermo Moreno is, for example, one of the only Peronists that defend Donald Trump and says explicitly that Donald Trump is a Peronist, and Javier Milei is misreading the actual course of the world, which is the West, which is moving to a more closed economy, a more 1940s style economy, where countries don't commerce a lot in great blocks rather than commercing with each other, like exports and imports between each country, what's called comercio país a país. So that's mainly the big difference between Guillermo Moreno and the rest. And this, and also, not only it's not only an ideological difference, it's also a methodological difference. Javier Milei and Donald Trump have share in common the methodology of getting into power, which is social media, participating in streaming channels, having trolls, and a digital army in Twitter, in X, that combat and fight for your ideas in social media, which is not something that, for example, other Peronists do. It's not something that Kirchners do because it's not in their traditional methodology. That's the main difference, and that's getting a lot of traction between many libertarians, but also many young Argentinians, which see, especially male. It's very similar in the process with Trump, with women, and many Peronist women still support Cristina Kirchner, while many Peronist men currently support a lot Guillermo Moreno, which is more traditional. It also socially and in the current state of the youth, it supports more traditional values, which is that's why it's so penetrating for the young population, because Guillermo Moreno interpeels, for example, the traditional wife. I mean, the trad wives on TikTok, we currently do trends in TikTok, in social media, are appealed in that sense by a more conservative, traditional style way of life, and Kirchnerism doesn't. The combat for Guillermo Moreno is against the progressiveness in Peronism, and it's a very long stand battle within Peronism, where the Peronists reject progressiveness and say we are a movement which was forged by a general, which is Juan Domingo Perón, a conservative Catholic general, which, despite he promoted the rights of the people, Guillermo Moreno always says that the rights for minorities had to be promoted when you have your the reference is when you have your fridge full. You need to have your fridge full. You gotta be able to eat before getting minority rights. Before, first of all, getting the rights for the majority. So then bringing the rights for the minority. That's a methodology that is very different, for example, from what Alberto Fernandez, the previous Peronist government, did. The criticism was Alberto Fernandez wasn't able to provide a stable economy and had a lot of inflation, and there was a massive inflation and massive instability. So he do the minority rights fight and try to promote himself as like a activist from women's rights, gay rights. After that, after all that, he was violent to his wife. I mean, he was aggressive to his wife. So that's the thing. Then Guillermo Moreno fights internally for that battle. I mean, that's the initial conception of Guillermo Moreno, and that's the idea from the background. And something more, which is very, which is happening right now. Cristina Kirchner, a few days ago, was condemned to prison, and the main problem within Peronism was that Cristina Kirchner's arrest and sent to jail, and her incapacity to run again for any public administration charges in the future will cost the unification of Peronism. Last night, there was a photo of all Peronist leaders which fight a lot between each other. I'm talking about Sergio Massa, former candidate for president, Juan Grabois, which is the Argentinian equivalent of AOC, for example. Juan Grabois, which fought against Guillermo Moreno. I mean, they were all seated in the same table discussing about the future of Peronism and how it's going Peronism to mobilize against Javier Milei and against this judicial system that imprisoned Cristina Kirchner for corruption charges. Uh, so this is a different, I mean, the scenario is changing already. I mean, the article we are citing about and we are talking about for this podcast is already old regarding the current state of affairs because of the mobilization of Peronism. What is indeed interesting is that there are two paths forward for Peronism. Either Peronism joins together in a fully Peronist, non-progressive alliance against Javier Milei, representing more conservative values, but fighting for redistribution as it historically did, or as a Argentinian journalist said last week, the Hunger Games begin, and there's a very rough, violent battle for power. But the thing is, right now, if Peronism goes together, there's a lot of anger and frustration, especially in the basis of the Peronist activists, which are very angry with the current state of affairs and what happened with Cristina Kirchner and the current advances of the libertarian administration over the state, um, over the pensions, over the pensions for the elderly, etc., etc., etc. There's a lot of anger and frustration and a strong feeling of impotence, which might be channeled by a Peronist movement inside. But this might cause a lot of instability to the current administration of Javier Milei, which is one of the big risks that Argentina faces in the future.
Thank you so much. That's a very in-depth explanation of these dynamics we're seeing. And I suppose it's hard to say what will come at the next election.
It's very hard to think right now, but there are two, as I mentioned, there are two ways in Peronism in the future. Cristina Kirchner's future, Cristina Kirchner, the problem with Cristina Kirchner mainly was her massive popularity from within Peronism. It was very difficult for anyone internally to confront her, but her incapability to win elections externally. She was not able to win against the non-Peronist forces. So the judicial system, despite the judicial system putting her into jail, they have just unified Peronism all together to go against the current state of affairs. And the current state of affairs is that there are a lot of people in Peronism which are very angry, which are very frustrated, and the anger that Javier Milei promotes against journalism, against alternative voices, against the leftists might be switched back again against the same libertarians. I mean, this is a wheel game when you started in the bottom, but then you can be on top again, and the one who was in the top can be down again. So, as we say, life is a wheel here. So, if you are very rough with your political enemies when you're in power, when the cycle changes, there might be a very hard aggression against the libertarians when the wheel is back. And that anger and frustration right now between the young people and between a lot of Peronists is not currently represented by Axel Kicillof, the governor of Buenos Aires, or Sergio Massa, the ex-president, the ex runner for president in the previous elections. Currently, right now, it's mainly represented by Guillermo Moreno or Cristina Kirchner. There are no other reference, especially in the digital arena. Especially in the digital arena. In the non-digital arena, there's a lot of more presence of Axel Kicillof, the governor of Buenos Aires. However, I think what 2023 election taught Argentinians and the Trump elections to the Americans is that we must not underestimate the weight that digital arena has. No, not only going through national news media, not only going for national news media, for example, Kamala Harris not going to Joe Rogan program was a huge mistake, which Donald Trump was able to capitalize. That's the same here in Argentina. The digital arena is something that Peronism traditionally underestimated, and I think it's a big mistake. And the only person who is not underestimated in this case is Guillermo Moreno.
Yes, absolutely. That's something we're seeing in elections all around the world these days. Thank you so much for joining us.
No, thank you guys for inviting me.